it can ignite, and all you gotta do is bring the light, 'cause a new light shines.
Shalom, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Light Lab podcast. My name is Eliana Light, and I am here with my dear friends Cantor Ellen Dreskin.
Good day, everybody.
And Rabbi Josh Warshawski.
A good day indeed.
I love that. Good day to you, dear friends. It kind of makes sense that we're speaking in old-timey ways. It was a terrible segue, but I'm rolling with it, people, because our opening question for the day is that I want to know something about your ancestors. So, Ellen, can you tell me something about your ancestors?
Oh, my goodness. What I know only goes back a couple of generations, oddly enough. But in terms of my ancestors, I feel that I have Texas roots and I have deep Eastern European roots. And the mixture is very interesting. But my family came over from Eastern Europe to America in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And out of my 4 grandparents, 3 of them were born in Eastern Europe. Only one was born here in America. So I feel like I got the best of both worlds. Hardworking, Yiddish speaking, except for my mother, who was born and raised in Texas. And yeah, it's a very kind of Fiddler on the Roof meets Texas ancestry.
You know what? I would watch that show. That sounds delightful. Some sort of Oklahoma, but it's actually Texas Fiddler hybrid. Incredible. Josh, tell us something about your ancestors.
So my great uncle at one point was keeping like a really comprehensive family tree, and I have to track it down because I don't feel off the top of my head that I know enough about my ancestors. I know that on both sides of my family, 3 generations at least have been in America, born in America. So lots of roots in Chicago, in an auto parts business over there. And then, but the Warshawski side also went back to Poland at some point, to Warsaw, hence the name. And on the other side to Romania. That's what I got.
What I have to say blew my mind. Warshawski has something to do with Warsaw. Who knew? But now that you say that, it makes so much sense.
Not lately, I guess when I've been traveling over the last couple of years, I run into various people in various different places who say, hey, I know a Warshawski. Are you related? And generally, I don't know who that Warshawski is. But at some point, we were probably all on the same street in Warsaw together. I think that was sort of the modifier that got into Ellis Island for many of us.
That's a nice thought. You know, there are all those stories running around. My mom's grandparents, I suppose, were Burman, and the story is that they showed up at Ellis Island and they said, Isaac, what is your name? Or they said, what is your name? And the translator says, what do they call you? And he said, Isaac the beer man, because he sold beer. Now, is that true? I don't know. On my father's side, my uncle got a hold of my great-grandfather's Ellis Island papers. We always thought that our name was originally Light in Russian or Polish, because that's where my family comes from. But our last name used to be Gatilis. And so I have no idea how we got from that to Light. And I'm also not related, besides my cousins and my immediate family, to any of the other Lights around. So no idea where that came from. And it's interesting, similar to you, Josh, I don't know that much about my immediate ancestry. And sometimes that can feel really defeating and sad. And I certainly want to know more about who they were, but I also feel like I don't know that much about my own family. Like I ask my mom all the time, like, what was it like for you growing up? What kind of things did you do with your friends? Like, what did you love? There's a yearning that I have to feel like I'm a part of something. I think that's one of the reasons I loved the Lower East Side so much. When I lived in New York, I would just go to the Lower East Side and wander around, get a pickle, get a knish, and I would feel like this is the land of my ancestors. And then I remember being down there with a friend once and saying, this is the land of my people. He was like, Eliana, your family never lived in New York. They went straight to Chicago or Canada. Like, this is not where you come from. But we as Jews are blessed with a sense of collective heritage, which means that even though I don't know my immediate ancestry, I get to feel a part of an incredible lineage, which I find to be very meaningful because it keeps me rooted and reminds me of the connection that I have to all Jewish folk and to really all people everywhere, depending on how far back we go. And I asked this question today because we are finally, after taking 3 steps back and 3 steps forward, after doing a deep dive on Baruch Atah Yod He Vav He. And if you have not listened to those episodes, I suggest you go back so that you are prepared for us actually stepping into the first bracha of the Amidah. We have entered the praise section of the Amidah. Some might call the wow section of the Amidah, giving big ups to the Holy One over here. And we start with our ancestors. Traditionally, this section was called Avot. That means fathers in Hebrew. We'll talk in a little bit about how now many in the liberal Jewish world call it Avot V'Imahot, meaning fathers and mothers, patriarchs and matriarchs. So we're going to take it section by section, explore a little midrash interpretation, see how it feels to us. And listener, I would encourage you, if you want to use this for your own education, do that as well. Listen to it, pause the podcast and think, how do I respond to this? What does this make me feel? And join in on the conversation with us. And Josh, take it away.
All right, so we're going to make our way into the first section here just by reading through the names, which is the names of our ancestors that we call out. I'm reading from the conservative movement's new Lev Shalem Shabbat and Festival Siddur, which actually has 2 paragraphs next to each other, one that has just the patriarchs and one that has the patriarchs and matriarchs. I'm going to read from the latter, and we'll see where it takes us. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu. And then in parentheses there it says also ve'imotenu. Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, ve'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, ve'Elohei Leah. In the translation here on the side it says Baruch atah Adonai, untranslated, our God and God of our ancestors, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, God of Sarah, God of Rebekah, God of Rachel, and God of Leah. So, what do we notice? What's standing out to anybody so far?
Well, there's repetition of just a few words over and over again in there. That's what I'm noticing. There's a rhythm to it right off the bat.
There is a definite rhythm, even in the blessing part. Also interesting to notice that it was left untranslated in that Siddur, because it's really hard to translate those 3 words.
Glad we had a whole podcast episode about it.
Exactly. Even the way Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah has a rhythm and a rhyme, even though Leah, technically, if you're going by who was married first, she would be the sister that would be first. And I know some people that do say Leah before Rachel to kind of give her that kavod, that honor, but there is a really nice flow to the way that it sounds now. And it's also not something I hear read out very often. Like it sounds like a beautiful poem. And
now that you're saying that, I mean, it clearly the rhyming there is definitely intentional. There's so much rhyming or like things that fit when you say them out loud. There's a meter to the Hebrew in prayer that was clearly intentional. And I think that was why the choice was made, I think, in many Siddurim to put Leah after Rachel. And whenever we generally list out our ancestors and the matriarchs, I think if I've heard it more often in that direction, probably for that very reason.
So I want to go to this point about this section and the different ways that it can be said, right? One side of the page just says Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov are 3 patriarchs. And then the other side adds Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah. In the span of Jewish history, that's a pretty recent addition happening in the last few decades or so, I might say, at least in the more mainstream Siddurim. I can imagine that it was bubbling up maybe in the Chavurah movement, the renewal or reconstructing Judaism movements, other sort of grassroots places, but it's only become mainstream in the past few decades. And I know, at least for me, it's something that I didn't adopt until later in my spiritual journey. And Ellen, I wanted to ask you about it. How do you feel?
It's really interesting. I grew up with only the patriarchs, but I also grew up in a classical reform congregation in Houston, Texas. And I don't even know that I was all that familiar with the Hebrew, and I know I wasn't familiar with the source text, et cetera. I really, looking at this phrase, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, I like to look at it in context. This exact phrase comes from Torah. It comes from Moses' experience at the burning bush in Exodus 16:3. And when God is describing God's self to Moses at the burning bush, God says, I'm Elohei Avotecha, as opposed to Elohei Avotenu. I am the God of your ancestors, or if we're going to be gender insensitive, of your fathers, and then list them, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, et cetera. And so I think that our Imahot were added later on in an effort to be gender equal, in an effort to give merit to our matriarchs as well as our patriarchs. And yet, I can't help but hold on to that. The Elohei Abraham, the patriarch part, is supposed to remind me, or it does remind me, of each time I enter the Amidah, of that burning bush moment, of that very individual moment between Moses and God. And that loses its power for me when we add on the matriarchs. And I hope I haven't offended anybody, but I grew up with the patriarchs. And when they add the matriarchs, I learned it through summer camp, through the URJ summer camping. And so from my experience, much like many of our contemporary melodies, the matriarchs came home from camp and took seed in our home congregations and then started to grow there in the Reform movement.
What you're saying is totally valid because they're your feelings, and prayer is personal, right? Tefillah is both personal, what we say, and it's also communal and political in the choices that we make. Synagogues choosing to add the matriarchs, for a lot of them, was a pretty big deal, because I think for a lot of synagogues, it signaled aspirationally how they wanted women to be treated in their congregations. For me, one of the reasons that I didn't add the matriarchs in my personal Amidah was because sometimes it felt just like that, like a token. And to say that if a synagogue cared about women's leadership, there would be other things that you did. You know, my father was a rabbi. I've been around the politics of this my whole life. I remember one of the synagogues we were at, we had left, they were looking at a rabbi. She would have been the first woman rabbi of their congregation. First female rabbi. No, this was like 8 years ago. Shouldn't be a big deal, but it still is. And people were saying, well, I don't care that she's a woman, but people will care. Won't people care? Won't this be a problem for people? I'm like, who are these people? Where did they go? Who are they? Right? It's you. You just want to don't want to say you have a problem with it. So what does it mean for something to be token or for it to really be representative? You know, there are congregations where they also add Bilhah and Zilpah, who were Yaakov's concubines, who also birthed the sons that gave birth to all of us, the 12 tribes. So how can we be inclusive in a way that isn't token, and how do we make it even more inclusive?
What I do really appreciate is the reminder when we add these names or any others that Siddur, that liturgy is not Torah in terms of its text, and that we are allowed and invited and given wholehearted permission, I think, to add words and include words that make our entire liturgical experience more inclusive. And that I hardly approve of.
Yeah, I really like the idea of thinking of the textual sources where the words of our prayers come from. And so, you know, that really resonated with me what you said, Ellen, about taking those words from that particular verse and thinking back to that burning bush moment as the moment that we're entering when we enter into this prayer. I think that's really powerful. And now I'm also thinking about, if we're to understand, and you know, there's a lot of different opinions about this, but if we're to understand where the Torah came from, and for some people who think that the words of the Torah were divinely inspired, but were written down by human beings or even crafted by human beings, the people that were writing down those words were most likely male. And so, you know, maybe if they were words of the Torah were crafted or divinely inspired in a different way, then our matriarchs would have been present in that moment at the burning bush. And that's in some ways, some spheres, that might be a blasphemous thing to say, that we could add those words to the Torah since we weren't supposed to add or subtract at all. But I'm thinking about, there's this book of feminist midrash that I've been studying in Chavruta called Dir Shuni, and it's all midrashim written by female identifying professors in Israel who are crafting new stories and understandings based on the words in the Torah and the words that aren't in the Torah. So, that sort of got me thinking about, I wonder if there's a way that we can begin to think about feeling the presence of those people in that moment. It brings me to like a Star Wars sort of experience where, like, if anybody's seen Star Wars, where like at the end of some of the original trilogy and like they're having a celebration and you see the ghosts of all the people that should have been there. And so now I'm imagining the ghosts of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but also of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, and they're sort of present in that moment with us in the throne room. You can use it even in like Harry Potter, where they're like there's the attack and all these different ghosts come out. And so who is present with you in that moment when you enter into prayer? Got me thinking about that. And I guess I would also add that we actually use those words. The purpose of those words in that moment, I think, in a lot of different contexts, is zechut avot. It's the merit of our ancestors, that we want to use the words of others to help us gather our own thoughts and our own feelings and our own prayers. So in that moment, when we call out to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when we call out to Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, we're thinking about those particular moments of prayer of Moses in that moment also, and how we can use those words that are here in the Siddur to help open up the words of our own heart and soul.
That's really beautiful. And I love that imagery from Star Wars and Harry Potter, but it's that feeling of being supported. And our friend Chava Morel has led me in a mindfulness exercise when we were leading a service together, where she learned this from practitioners of mindfulness who didn't happen to be Jewish, but that if you stand, right, this is our Amidah, if we are able, we stand, to bend your knees, to feel your feet on the earth where your ancestors are, right? There's the idea and the spirit of our ancestors, and then there's the bodies of our ancestors, which are in and have become the earth. And to feel supported by the earth, to feel gravity meet your feet and hold you up, and to imagine your ancestors holding you up in that moment, I found it to be incredibly powerful. Because, right, there's a reason that the Amidah is starting here. And it's pretty smart of the editors of the Amidah, or the writers of the Amidah, to start us by focusing on our ancestors. We've already said that prayer is hard. That's where the Adonai Sfatai Tiftach bit comes in, help me pray. And so calling back to our ancestors is not just about saying, you had a great relationship with our ancestors, God, for the most part. Remember that when you think about how you want to relate to us, but that it's also supportive for us as individuals, so we don't feel like we're alone in this, so we feel like we're being supported and held and part of a lineage.
I was going to ask about, I did have that in my early religious school education, that idea of the reason the Amidah begins this way is because you're about to ask God for a lot of things, or you're entering into that private audience with God. It's time to remind God that you may be lowly nothingness, but you are descendants of great people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I so wonder about that it's also not so much to remind God, but to remind me, I'm not alone because I'm here in community praying these words in this moment. And I'm not alone because there is a thread, a spiritual thread of some sort that is running through. And I'm on that same thread. I'm in that same fabric.
Another thing I remember learning about this when I was young was asking the question, why does it say Elohe so-and-so, Elohe so-and-so, God of so-and-so, and not just God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah? I'm wondering what that says, how that speaks to all of us.
Yeah, I think we were probably taught the same thing when we were growing up and asking that question, which is the idea that the reason that it's the God of each particular person is that each of those people had different relationships with God and different connections to divinity. And so when we call out to God using all of these names, we call out and express that there are different ways to relate to and connect to and converse with and be in conversation with God. And if we can experience that and understand that, we can let that open ourselves up to our own connections and conversations and communication with God.
I actually have a song about that. I'm remembering now. Maybe we'll play a couple of seconds of it here. I was asked to find a musical component for this piece, and besides the nusach, which we'll talk about later, there really aren't any songs about it, but the song is from God's point of view, saying, I remember when I called out to your father. I remembered when I called out to your mother. And each little couplet harkens back to a story when God had a connection with that particular ancestor. And so it's a interesting teaching tool to ask the students to be like, well, who is it? Who is the song talking about there? And then the chorus is Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Elohecha, which is your God. And then at the end, it's Elohayich, your God in the feminine. So saying God is kind of calling out to us also through the Siddur in this moment, saying, I got to know your ancestors, and now I'm really excited to get to know you. Like, let's have a relationship. Let's connect together.
I often wonder if we were to put other names in there. I wonder about our patriarchs and matriarchs. While the Torah tells us about all the dialogues that took place in between our ancestors and God, mostly one's faith is acted out in one's life and the way one lives. And if I aspire to have those kinds of relationships, like, could I have a relationship with God like Abraham did, or like Isaac did, or Rebecca? I wonder about what if I were moved to say, gosh, I wish I were as inspired or strong or courageous as, and because we're recording it on the week that we're recording it, as say Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., then would I want to say, Elohei Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Elohei Reb Nachman, Elohei my grandma, who had a faith beyond anybody else I've ever known, that all of these are different manifestations and they play out in so many different ways in these people's lives. I'd like to remind myself of that too. And I wonder if you want to pause the podcast now and maybe think, if I could play a when Harry met Sally moment of I'll have what she's having, then who's God based on someone's actions in the universe? What would your be response to Elohei, fill in the blank? I'd like to have a relationship with God like I think that person does.
That's beautiful, and seems like a perfect time to take a break while you think about that, listener. So with that, we'll be right back. The next section we're going to talk about together is only a few words, but because of a couple of things that we'll talk about later, they've become some of my favorite words in the entire Siddur. Isn't it great that they're in the Amidah, so they show up all the time? Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora, El Elyon. I'm going to say that again because I love saying it. I want us to hear it. Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora, El Elyon. Jill Hammer in the Romamu Siddur translates that as God, deity, abundant, mighty, wondrous, O Most High, El Elyon, something about height and going up. How do we feel just hearing that kind of isolated piece of text?
For me, I get a little bit of a sense of like in the best way, a boulder starting to roll down a hill. There's a like if you kept going with the ha 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 repetition, that it would get more and more. I don't know, greater, heavier.
I don't know if it might be intentional, but when you were emphasizing all those ha's so beautifully, it felt very regal to me. It was like trumpets blasting. It was like this is like entering this throne room, and Yeah, I know. I thought about that idea before, but I really felt it manifest in the way that you were pronouncing the words.
One of the things that really connected me to this was a conversation I had with someone I met at Limud Southeast a couple of years ago at Ramah Darom. It's a big Jewish learning gathering, and I wish I remembered his name. I might have to find him because his midrash, his interpretation, had so much effect on me. He imagined that all of these names are kind of going up in transcendence, up, up, up into everything. So we start with Ha'el. That just means deity, God, right? This is what it is. We're naming it Hagadol, the great, Hagibor, the mighty, the Hanorah, the wondrous. It's kind of going up and out. And then we're El Elyon, God Most High. We're up here. And we're going to leave ourselves up here until we come to the end of this section. And then you'll see why this means a lot to me. But the other thing that means a lot to me is the intertext of it all, right? When we quote a line from Tanakh, it's understood potentially by the editors that we know all the stuff around it. And I learned this from Rav Eli Confer of Hadar, who, listeners, it's very exciting. We have an interview scheduled with him for the next couple of weeks. So that'll come out eventually. But he's done all of this incredible work on the Amidah. It was really meaningful to me. If you go to Deuteronomy 10, 16, 19, and again, we'll link the text in the show notes so you can follow along, it paints a very different picture. You know, when I work with students, a lot of them say, you know, we've said this before on the podcast, wow, God must have a really fragile ego if we have to keep telling God how great and wonderful and smart they are. Or they're just very egotistical. And that's why we need to tell them all of this. Why do we have to repeat it? But here are those lines. Umaltem et arlat levavchem, ve'arpechem lo takshu od. Cut away, therefore, the thickening around your hearts and stiffen your necks no more. Ki Adonai Elohechem hu Elohei ha'Elohim ve'Adonai ha'Adonim ha'el hagadol hagibor v'hanorah asher lo yisafanim ve'lo yikach shochad. For the Lord your God is God supreme and Lord supreme, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanorah, who shows no favor and takes no bribe. Oseh mishpat yatom v'almana ve'ohev ger latet lo lechem v'simla, but upholds the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and befriends the stranger, providing him with food and clothing. Ve'ahavtem et hager ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. So you too must befriend the stranger, love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Does this change anything? Knowing the intertext of where this comes from, how might this change our praying of this piece?
I don't want to jump the gun into the next section of the prayer, but even as you're speaking now, the next sentence makes a lot more sense to me. That if I know the context of these attributes, because the next part of our prayer is all about the chesed. So we'll go there in a second, but
that it makes sense to put this before the piece about God's loving kindness, because we're sharing here about God's kind of radical love.
Yes, that is part of the gadol and the gibor and the norah right there. And we would think it's like getting higher and higher into the heavens, when really it's all about staying in relationship with us. That's what I'm hearing in it now.
And in some ways, it gets into the specifics in a way that neither the preceding lines or the following lines are going to get into. And it's as if we're supposed to, the original prayers were ones who just knew the whole Talmud by heart. They knew the whole Torah by heart. So we're supposed to just know that these are the specific acts that we're talking about when we reference them with these sort of ethereal and large terms.
And that also, it's a reminder, and we'll talk about this a lot more next episode, that when we talk about God being strong and mighty, when we praise God's strength and might, it's not about the violence that God could commit. It's about the justice and the righteousness that God does in the world. God loves the widow and the orphan. God loves the stranger. And so we too are told, and I think this is the mitzvah, the commandment that comes up the most times in the Torah, is ve'ahavtem et hager, is to love the stranger. And it could have been very easy to say, well, the Egyptians treated us terribly, so let's never trust anybody again and let's treat everybody terribly. But the Torah goes out of its way to say the opposite. You know what it's like to go through some stuff. Treat others with love and respect and cherish them. And that's really powerful to take this piece about praise and flip it back into human relationships and how we treat each other. You know, Rabbi Shai held, one of the quotes of his that I love is, I don't really care whether you believe in God or not. I care about what the God you profess to believe in asks of you, right? What does God want from you? And in this piece that we read from Dvarim, God wants us to love the stranger. And that's a beautiful thing for us to take with us into the Amidah. I want to quickly mention before we move on to the next section, I'm going to post in the show notes this learning that I absolutely love. This piece of Talmud that I learned first from Rabbi Aaron Alexander. We don't have time to go through all of it now. The line Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanorah, particularly those last three adjectives, great, mighty, and awesome, shows up in the Tanakh in a couple of different places with some of those words missing. And the rabbis do this incredible thing where they look at each of those instances. So they're a little bit scandalized at first that all of these other people would misquote Moses because in their understanding, Daniel and Isaiah, the prophets, knew the whole Torah. So how could they misquote Moses? And not to give away the ending, but they kind of get to a place where they say, first of all, what it means to be great and mighty are different. You might have thought it was mighty to smite your enemy, but it's actually mighty to hold off and have patience, something like that. And then the other thing they say is that, well, in those times, it would have been a lie to say those things about God. And they knew God was the true God, so they didn't say those things about God. Which is incredible to wrestle with. What does it mean to have been handed a liturgy that other people wrote and then also have in the back of our minds? We need to be true about what God feels and what God is in this moment. But yeah, let's move to the next section, Ellen. There's so much more to say.
All right. Well, those last three words, in this moment, you know, that as we're continue throughout the prayer to remind ourselves about all of these qualities of God and what do we need and how did God manifest to different individuals throughout history. The prayer continues with Gomel Chasadim Tovim V'Koneh Hakol V'Zocher Chasdei Avot V'Imahot Umevi Geula Livnei V'Nehem L'Ma'an Shemo Be'ahava. It's a mouthful. After all the high and mighty, we really now get to a little bit of an opposite, perhaps. Gomel Chasadim Tovim, rewarding good acts, rewarding kindness and mercy, really. V'Koneh Hakol, also owning everything. The owner, the landlord, the super, that we are all and everything we know and everything we are God's possessions in a way. V'zocher, and here we go back to our ancestry again. V'zocher chasdei avot v'imahot. You remember the chesed, the kindness of our ancestors. This is what you want from us, huh? And you bring redemption to their children's children. And I love this phrase, and I'd love to hear more of what y'all think about this particular phrase, Lama'an Shemo Ba'ahava. What a beautiful, calm, bringing it down to earth part of the prayer for me.
There's so much happening in just these few words. You know, I'm glad we took on just this paragraph for this podcast because every word is just so meaningful. And I love that phrase, L'man Shemo Be'ahava, and ending this paragraph in connection with love. And I looked down at the Lev Shalem Siddur that I was referencing to see what it translates it as. And it says, Redeemer of their children's children for the sake of divine honor. And what does it say in the Siddur that you're using for a translation?
I have a very interpretive translation from Rabbi Marcia Prager, which folds it into the phrase, gradually embracing all things into one. How's that for interpretive?
Ooh, and Rabbi Jill Hammer's, for that whole paragraph, it's doing good to those who love, all creator, taking note of our ancestors' love, bringing healing to their descendants in love for the sake of the holy essence dwelling in the world.
For the sake of the holy essence dwelling in the world. I just looked at Mishkan Tefillah. It also just says, for their children's children, redemption of children's children for the sake of the divine name. Without that ahava sort of being specifically translated.
Well, the Sim Shalom Siddur, sorry to interrupt you, the Sim Shalom Siddur says, because of your loving nature.
I like that. There's something about
love.
Everyone's really avoiding the love.
I don't know why everybody's avoiding the ahava bit.
Well, and there's a big thing about because of or for the sake of, and how, I don't know, God's reputation reflects on ours and or vice versa in there, that we need to do something for God's sakes. My mother used to say, for God's sakes. I haven't thought about whatever. But what does it mean to do something for God's sake? I wonder.
And also, I was thinking about that Gomel Chasadim Tovim, and I looked up in one of the Hebrew online dictionaries the word Gomel again, and about this like sort of paying back and redeeming. And I guess if we're reading Gomel Chasadim Tovim, I think if we read it literally, it's God pays back pays back one who does chasadim tovim, as opposed to God being the one doing the chasadim tovim. Is that grammatically incorrect to say? Right? I think most translations I've said is the God who is the one who's acting with loving kindness. But if gomel is to recompensate or to pay back, gomel chasadim tovim, could it also be read as one who sort of pays back, one who acts with loving kindness?
I got that second impression. If I'm understanding you correctly, Josh, of the reward is going to those who act in that way. Is
right.
That what you...
That is what I'm saying. I think that the way that I had originally understood those words is that it was God who is acting with loving kindness. Even with some of these translations, a transcendent God who acts with kindness and love is the translation that I see in my Siddur. But now that I'm thinking about it the way that you've read it, I'm thinking that it's not God who's supposed to be acting with loving kindness. It's God who is responding to our acts of loving kindness.
Okay, this might be taking it a little too far, but liknot, we're doing it though. Liknot in modern Hebrew means to buy, right? Like to purchase. It's almost like God is paying us back for like rewarding good deeds. And then it's like, nope, I'll take it all, everything. I'm taking the whole world. It's all, I love it so much. It's all mine. I don't know. I'll take the whole store.
I like that. I even like it. I wonder if it's like, if we're using it in the language of like acquiring, like acquire a friend or acquire a rabbi, a teacher, that these acts of loving kindness that we do, that God is sort of paying us back for, God is ascribing to God's self all of those acts also. When we act like God, God gets to sort of tally those as kindness acts of God's own self.
Mm-hmm. Which speaks back to us doing things for God's name's sake and doing them in love. Is that, Yisrael, it's always this aspect of relationship of being in balance with and in touch with. I love that about the whole give and take.
Me too. And the idea that we're in partnership, we and God are doing these acts of loving kindness. We and God are acting in these ways. We're learning from each other's examples in a way.
Something that I read about in My People's Prayer book on the Amidah, where a lot of this is coming from, is that poetically, it's starting small and getting bigger, which apparently is a poetic structure that's used all over the Siddur. Ha'el Hagadol, etc. is one word. El Elyon, 2. Gomel Chasidim Tovim, 3. V'zocher Chasdei Avot, and then we have Umevi Goel Lifnei V'nel Mishmar, which is one long phrase to kind of say that we are expanding and expanding and expanding, even in this one section, moving kind of from the esoteric to the more tangible. Also wanted to point out something you mentioned when we were talking, Josh, about Goel versus Geula.
Yeah, so I had always grown up in the Siddurim that I'd used with the word Goel, with who brings a redeemer to us, and reckoning back to Mashiach, to the Messiah, to the sort of eventual redemption of coming from an individual. In all the reform liturgy, the word is replaced with the word Geula, redemption, as in who brings redemption to our children's children. That this redemption is an idea. It's something that we can aspire to and something that can be brought about, but isn't coming from an individual. And the reason why is going back to that ahava, right? There's this love that brings us back to the why the redemption is coming for us. And I like that idea of bringing it into redemption as opposed to using the goel. And as someone who has just sort of begun to experiment with changing liturgy for myself with some of the prayer language, with some of my own melodies, I think I've never tried to pray with it with the word geula, with this redemption. And I think that's something that now I'm inspired to try and take on and see how it feels and sounds and tastes for myself.
And it's so interesting, Josh, because I never heard goel until I was an adult, because I grew up with geula. And my impression about the reason that it is that way in the Reform movement also has to do with Reform views about the Messiah, of course, and that not a messianic age as opposed to an individual Messiah. So that geula translates as a card-carrying Reform Jew for me as geula is the messianic age would be the translation I grew up with.
Yeah. One other thing I would just say to give Goel a little bit more potential midrash is I wonder if there's a way for us to say that the person who is praying is the Goel or Goelet that we're talking about, right? Is there a way to understand that as like each one of us could be the Redeemer, should that happen to occur?
And it doesn't say ha goel now, does it? It's
Unspecified.
just goel. Yes, yeah. Unspecified. Well done.
Reminds me, I walked into my dad's office one day when I was a kid and I was like, what are you reading? And he shows me the book and it's called something like, There Is No Messiah and You're It. And I was like, how's the book? And he said, well, it's really the title, like the whole thing. That's the whole thing. There is no Messiah and you're it. But it's also reminding me of the tradition of inviting, quote unquote, Eliyahu Hanavi to be at our baby naming and covenant ceremonies. The reason that I learned for that is because who knows, right? Eliyahu Hanavi is supposed to herald the coming of the Redeemer or the age of redemption. This person that was just born could in fact be it. Who knows? But I love the idea here that it says, Goel, maybe it is each of us.
Beautiful. I think that the book you're referring to is by Larry Kushner. We might have to look that one up. I'm almost certain. I think that it's on my shelf in the room next door.
Oh my gosh. Well, now that I've thought of it again, I'm going to have to read it and we'll put it in the show notes. And with that, we'll be right back.
Keep burning bright. Shine, 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 shine everywhere. Shine, shine, shine.
We are now rounding the corner to the end of this particular paragraph. We are almost at the Chatima. We talked about that in last week's episode, the thematic summation in blessing form. Before we do that, if you are in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, or on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, there's an addition that you do here right after Shemo B'Ahava. Zochrenu l'chaim, melech chafetz b'chaim, v'chotvenu b'sefer hachayim lemancha Elohim chayim. You can already hear the theme, which is chayim. Hey, that rhymes. Remember us that we may live, O King who delights in life. Inscribe us in the book of life for your sake, living God. We won't get so into that today. Maybe we'll do a whole episode on the additions for the high holidays into the Amidah, because they're so beautiful and fascinating. Then we get to this last bit. Melech, Ozer, U, Moshia, Umagen. Some texts say Melech, Ozer, Ufoked, Umoshia, Umagen. Baruch Ata Adonai, Magen Avraham. Some versions say Baruch Ata Adonai, Magen Avraham, Ufoked Sarah. Some versions say Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah. I'm wondering what your translations say. Magen Avraham, Foked, Ezrat. What do you have, Josh?
I have shield of Abraham and guardian of Sarah. I think probably to make the connection of shield and guardian to translate them in a similar fashion.
Mm-hmm. So the Hebrew that I'm looking at has Ezrat Sarah, and it says protector of Abraham, supporter of Sarah.
I wonder if one of those is a quote from the text, because what I'm looking up now, which is why you might hear me poking around on my computer because I forgot to pull it up, is that Magen Avraham is also kind of a quote from Genesis 15. There we go. After a whole bunch of things happened, after the thing with the kings, Abraham fighting all these kings and Cholodemeyer and kings with weird names. After all this stuff, God comes to Avram in a vision, not even Abraham yet, and says, Al tira Avram anochi magen lach. I am a shield for you. And so I wonder if what the difference is kind of textually between Foked Sarah and Ezrat Sarah.
The Foked Sarah also comes from Genesis, right? We have it in chapter 21, verse 1. Vadonai pakad et Sarah ka'asher amar. Going back to the holidays, that's what we read on the Binding of Isaac. And Ezrat Sarah?
We don't know. So, listeners, if you know why in the Reformed liturgy we say the Ezrat Sarah, and why in the conservative liturgy we say Foked Sarah, and that there are other liturgies that do other things, definitely let us know. We find this stuff interesting. Yeah. When we were talking about Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanorah, I shared the first part of this midrash, this interpretation that I learned from a person at Limud Southeast that was meaningful to me. Here's the second part, which is that now in this piece, we're coming down back into immanence. Melech, ruler, king. Ozer, partner, helper. Umoshia, savior. Like to save someone, you kind of have to be in their vicinity. You have to have skin in the game. You got to be in it. Umagain, which is a shield, which is right in front of your face. So first we go up in transcendence and we're floating all around, and then we come back down. That God, that holiness, that support, however we might imagine it, it's up there and everywhere, and it's also right in front of my face. It's also right here. It's personal. It's that kind of immanence transcendence thing we also see in Adon Olam, which has the beginning part is high and mighty, and the end is and my relationship to the Holy One. But we get all of that in this tiny paragraph. This tiny paragraph, we go from floating amongst the stars to a shield right in front of my eyes. I find that very meaningful.
It is that you realize the wisdom of the words and the open parentheses, insert prayer, the closed parentheses. The poetry of the liturgy is very striking.
And to kind of close our discussion of this paragraph, during our taping, I found a translation that I had written. So I want to share it with everyone. It was like, oh, I wonder if my translation has the word love in it somewhere. We start with Adonai Sfatai, help me find my own words to say to the universe. I experience your blessing, Holy One, through my ancestors and their stories. They each had their own relationship with you. Divine, great, mighty, awesome, over everything, source of loving kindness, source of all creation, connecting us to the deeds of our past, bringing redemption through love. Whether we feel your presence as a ruler, helper, guardian, protector, or shield, we experience your blessing, Holy One, who guarded our ancestors. And with that, we'll be right back.
Keep burning bright. Shine, 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 shine a new light. Shine, 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 shine. Keep burning bright.
While we were taking a break, I had a thought that perhaps the reason that we can say Ezrat Sarah is that Ozer, helper or partner, is already in that list. Melech Ozer Umoshia Umagain. Magain is taken by Avraham. Moshia, redemption. I don't know. Sarah lived a pretty tough life. I don't know if redemption was part of it. Melech isn't really how they would imagine God back in that time. So Ozer seems to be a fit, which is interesting to note. In any case, we're not going to talk about our favorite melodies for this text because for the most part, there aren't different melodies that people write. I'm sure people do. I love singing this part in my own prayer and seeing what melody comes out. But the way we usually vocalize this text is through nusach, the different modes that we use. So Ellen, I would love for you to hum a few bars, as it were. What are the different nusachot?
Nuschaot.
Nuschaot.
Yes.
I
Great
love. I
word.
learned so much.
It's like,
Nuschaot.
I can
Yes.
name that nusach in 3 notes. We're going to do name that nusach for a little bit. And depending upon the time of year and even the time of week that it is, these same words have different melodies when chanted. I think most of us are most familiar with the Shabbat version of these words. And I won't say anything about what the intended mood is, but hopefully that will give us some food for discussion in just about 30 seconds. Our Shabbat melody goes like this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Velohei Avotenu V'Imahotenu Elohei Abraham Elohei Isaac Elohei Yaakov. And then it could either come back down or go up as you were talking, Elia. Elohei Sarah Elohei Rika Elohei Rachel Elohei Leah. So that's a very familiar melody, perhaps. And what if for those of us who are not used to davening every day of the week, we might never hear the weekday melody for these same words, which has a different feel about it, perhaps. It goes like this. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu Velohei Avotenu V'Imahotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah. A different kind of feel. And we get to the high holy days, and here's a whole third way of singing it. And I'm sure there are a lot more in each of these different forms. It's my way of doing it. For the high holy days, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Velohei Avotenu V'Imahotenu. And it goes on in that sort of vein, all for the same words, 3 very different forms of singing it. So what do y'all make of that?
First of all, it's so interesting that even amongst Nusach, there's so many different variations because the flourish, there's a flourish in that way of doing for Shabbat. Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, and then the coming back down, which is really beautiful that I didn't grow up with. Elohei, really beautiful, but not as majestic. And that's kind of what I feel, that the Shabbat adds a little bit of majesty and a bit of stateliness and awesomeness in that way. And then High Holidays just takes it right over the edge. We're leaning in. And for me, it's the difference. Almost I'm thinking between like praying in a field and praying in a cathedral. And I like both. I like to be in the field and in the cathedral, but in the cathedral, like my built environment is attempting to help me feel majesty. And so those nusach, I'm going to say it wrong. Those nuschaot are kind of like the built environment trying to help me get to a place of majesty.
I'm feeling the same way. I'm feeling the majesty that comes from the Shabbat liturgy and again, or the Shabbat nusach, and even more so from the high holidays. And I love that built-in majesty. And I love the idea that we have different nuschaot for all of these days. I think that it's amazing that we tell time through melody, that we tell time through music, that we place ourselves on the calendar based on the way that we sing. So that's really beautiful. And it was also fascinating to me, I think Eliana's eyes popped up also, that the weekday nusach that I learned was different from the weekday nusach that you learned. And also when I spent a little time in Orthodox circles when I was in college, and the weekday nusach that they used was also very different from the one that I grew up with and the one that you just shared with us right now. Right. The one that I grew up with was Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Velohei Avotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov Elohei Zerah, etc. But it feels like I have somewhere to be, right? It sort of feels like in the same way that the melody that you shared with us feels not I wouldn't say rushed, but moving in a different way.
And I think in a more, it's lacking the majesty perhaps, but it is there. When you said in the sanctuary or in the field, Eliana, I thought that the day melody for me, the daily nusach is a very like in the field, on my way to work, experiencing God, not in a throne room necessarily, but in an everyday kind of way. It's a little quicker.
But we get to experience the Amidah in all of these different contexts where the words are the same, but the occasion is different. And there's value in finding the spirit in the everyday, in the field, and there's value in the high holidays and the cathedral, and we get to experience it all. So I'm feeling really jazzed about all of this, because I know the next time I come across the Amidah in my own prayer practice, more will be opened to me. And that's one of our goals of doing this for ourselves, I think, and for you, dear listener. So think about, what of this are you taking away with you? And you might notice that if you come across this section of the Amidah, how does it feel for you? What do you imagine? We're going to end with a visualization, a little prayer practice based on that teaching that I shared. So I invite you, if you're in a place where you are able to settle in, feel your feet on the ground, connected again to your ancestors. Roll your shoulders back. Place your hands on your lap. Palms open for receiving, palms closed for grounding. Close your eyes. Start to breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, following the natural pattern of your breath and yet deepening your breath. Breathing out through your feet, feeling held and supported by the ground, by your ancestors. With each name of the divine, we expand our awareness. We expand our awareness to encompass more than we thought possible, feeling a part of it all. So over these next few words, go wherever your imagination takes you. How does it feel? What do you see? Ha'el, God. Hagadol, the great. Hagibor, the mighty. Hanorah, the awesome. El Elyon, divine one, most high. Where are you? Can you expand your awareness into space, celestial bodies, the stars? Knowing you are part of it all, and the Holy One that is part of you is also part of this. Float in this space for a minute, while knowing we have to come back down to earth, but we don't need to be afraid. Melech, ruler. Ozer, helper. Okade, guardian. Again, shield. How are you feeling shielded, helped, guarded, or ruled at this moment? What is the protection that you could seek to feel? Can you imagine the Holy One right in front of your face, almost touching your nose? That presence is always here. The Holy One is the biggest and the smallest, the entire universe, and in front of your face and inside of your heart. Take one more deep breath in, breathing in that knowledge, that feeling, being held and loved and supported. You can open your eyes. Thank you so, so much, dear listener. Please, if you're enjoying the podcast, do all those lovely things like rating and reviewing and sharing with people that you also think would love it. We've really loved hearing your feedback. You can reach us at Instagram at thelight.lab. Thank you so much, Christy Dodge, for editing. Thank you, Yafa, for your amazing work on the show notes and our social media. Our theme music is A New Light by me. And thank you so much to Ellen and Josh for joining me today.
My pleasure.
See you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Here, ונזכה כולנו, והיו